2009, Dickie Peterson died in obscurity, a poverty-stricken death in a small German town. And here's the cruelest irony. While the man is forgotten, his legacy roars across the planet. It's the sound he invented, heavy metal, the sound that built billion-dollar empires for Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. So how did the creator starve while others feasted in the building he built? This is the story of a laborer who built an empire but was never paid. His tragedy was decided from the moment of his birth. He was not born into a center of culture. He was born into silence. Richard Allen Dickie Peterson was born on September 12, 1946 in Grand Forks, North Dakota. We must first pause and understand what this location means, because it is not the swinging post-war cultural explosion of London or New York. This is the Midwest, the Great Plains, a landscape defined by its overwhelming, soul-crushing flatness. It is a place defined by its brutal 9-month winters, by the howl of the prairie wind, and by a profound, isolating silence. Grand Forks in 1946 was a city of function, an agricultural hub of grain elevators and sugar beet processing. This was a world built not on dreams, art, or fame, but on labor and stoicism. This was a place where Lutheran and Scandinavian values of hard work, quiet suffering, and absolute practicality were not just virtues, but the code of survival. You did your job, you did not complain, you did not stand out, and you endured. This cultural landscape was defined by something else too, a psychological isolation from the rest of America. As historical accounts of North Dakota from the 1950s reveal, the people of the state often felt alienated from the mainstream of American life. There was a deep-seated feeling of being looked down upon by the coasts, a sense of being the flyover country before that term even existed. This was a misfit state, a place that felt it was not part of the real cultural conversation. Into this world of quiet endurance and cultural inferiority, Dickie Peterson was born. He was the son of a modest middle-class family, not farmers, as some legends suggest, but people deeply embedded in the local work ethic. Life in the post-war 1940s and early 1950s in this part of the country was still defined by scarcity and frugality. You helped your family, you did your chores, and you prepared for a life of hard, practical work. But Dickie Peterson was different, possessing a spirit that seemed at odds with the frozen plains. He was by nature an introvert, a quiet kid who kept his thoughts to himself. Yet beneath that quiet exterior, he was filled with a strange, pent-up nervous energy that needed a release. In a world that demanded conformity and silence, he was a misfit. From the very start, he didn't fit the practical mold of the boys around him, who were destined to be workers or soldiers. This conflict, this feeling of being the wrong shape for the practical hole he was born into, created a profound need for an escape. He was a pressure cooker of internalized, unexpressed energy, waiting for a spark. For him, music wasn't a hobby, a trifle, or a waste of time. It was a pressure valve. It was the only ambition he could see in a world that only offered survival. This is the psychological key to his entire life and to the specific sound he would later create his environment of extreme suppression. The quiet stoicism of the Midwest is what created his need for extreme volume. His loud music, the noise he would one day unleash, was a direct psychological rebellion against the quiet. It was the sound of a lifetime of silence exploding all at once. The practical versus ambition conflict was not as simple as a boy rebelling against a non-musical family. He actually came from a home that valued music, where his father played the trombone and his mother played the piano. This was not a home devoid of art, but the context of that art was strictly defined by the practical code music, was a practical domestic comfort, a hobby, something you did in the parlor or at church to pass the long winters. It was not viewed as a job, a profession, or a practical path to survival. It was a luxury to be enjoyed after the work was done, not the work itself. This is a crucial distinction in understanding the friction that would develop in Dickie's life. The ambition he was developing was not just for music, but for music as a life. A choice that was seen as a betrayal of the practical world. Dickie was drawn to instruments from a very young age, showing a natural aptitude that went beyond casual interest. He started, like many boys of his era, with the guitar, trying to find his way around the fretboard. But there was something about the guitar that didn't quite fit his personality or his internal noise. It was too treble, too melodic, perhaps too front and center for his introverted nature. He found himself gravitating toward the lower frequencies, the sounds that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. He switched to the bass guitar around the age of 13, a decision that would define his destiny. And the reason for this switch is the other half of his survival story. He did it to follow and accompany his older brother, Dickie Peterson. Jerry was not just a sibling. He was a musician, a mentor, and Dickie's first true ally. Jerry was the only other misfit in his immediate world who understood the ambition to make music a life. Jerry was Dickie's first labor crew, the only other member of his real artistic family. This bond, this practical need to work with his brother, is what moved him to the bass. And his choice of the bass is the most important psychological detail of his early development. He did not choose the flashy, melodic star instrument, the lead guitar that seeks attention. He did not choose to be the voice at first. He chose the instrument of support. He chose the bass. Why did he make this choice? Because the bass is the engine, the foundation, and the laborer of the band in the practical world of North Dakota. The bass was the instrument that did the heavy lifting. It was the tractor, the factory engine, the thrumming, vibrating force that held everything else up. His ambition had found its perfect practical tool in the four strings of the bass. He was not a poet like Jim Capaldi, nor a preacher's son like Clarence Clemens. He was a laborer, a man who wanted to build a solid foundation. He was a heavy machine operator in training. He immediately began his apprenticeship with the grim determination of a worker learning a trade. He was a working-class kid in a harsh environment, so he applied the only ethic he knew. He worked. He was self-taught, driven by that introverted, obsessive energy that consumed him. He would spend hours, days, locked away, deconstructing the sounds he heard on the radio. And what was he listening to in the frozen isolation of Grand Forks? What was his link to the outside ambition world, the radio signals drifting in from Chicago and the South? But he wasn't drawn to the clean, polite, practical pop of the hit parade. He was drawn to the rawest, most honest music he could find on the dial. He was drawn to the blues and R&B, specifically the electric sounds coming out of Chicago. His influences were the giants of the genre, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Otis Redding. This is a crucial clue to his psyche. Why Otis Redding and Howlin' Wolf? Because they were pure soul and pure power. They were not slick stars. They were forces of nature, practical men whose voices were tools of raw emotional labor. They didn't sing pretty. They sang hard. His other influences were the fathers of heavy electric blues, men who amplified their pain. This was the practical music of other laborers, men who worked hard and played harder. This was music that wasn't pretty or polished. It was music that worked, music that had weight, music that sweated. It was the sound of distortion, of fuzz, of amplifiers being pushed to their limits to be heard in noisy clubs. This is where his style was forged. In the attempt to mimic these giants, he was a white, misfit kid in North Dakota, thousands of miles from the Delta or the south side of Chicago. Because he was from the North, he didn't copy the blues exactly. He reinterpreted it through his own lens. He was trying to make his bass sound like the heavy machinery of his environment. He was trying to replicate the raw, fuzzy, overdriven sound of the blues. But with the force of the practical world, he knew he was not a musician in the classical sense. He was becoming a heavy machine operator. This is the invention of heavy metal, happening in a vacuum. Years before the term existed, it represents the practical labor of the Midwest fusing with the emotional labor of the blues. By the early 1960s, Dickie Peterson was a teenager, living a dangerous double life. By day, he was still the son of the practical Midwest, a young man expected to find a trade and settle down. But by night, he was the Godfather of volume in miniature, a local hero in the small, rough clubs of Grand Forks. He was already playing professionally, or at least as professionally as one could in the isolated landscape of North Dakota. He played in high school bands, grinding out covers in VFW halls and bars. This duality was unsustainable. The ambition was at war with the survival code every single day. The noise he was making, the sheer vibrating force he was pulling from his bass, was simply too big for the silence of the Great Plains. He dedicated himself to his craft with the grim, obsessive focus of a musical laborer. He wasn't just playing, he was working the instrument. He spent every waking hour deconstructing records, his fingers raw from practicing. He was mastering his heavy machine, being the bass guitar. This work ethic, born directly from his practical upbringing, made him a formidable, powerful, and incredibly tight musician. He was not a dreamer in the psychedelic sense. He was an apprentice, honing his trade for a factory that didn't even exist in his hometown. This local reputation, however, was a form of anonymity in itself. Being the loudest, rawest musician in Grand Forks was like being the fastest runner in a locked room. The practical world saw his dedication not as discipline, but as a failure to grow up. It was a rejection of his roots, a refusal to accept the quiet life prepared for him. This misfit status, which had defined his childhood, was now becoming a professional prison. The ambition was screaming for an escape, for a world where his noise was not a problem, but a virtue. And then, in the mid-1960s, around 1965 or 1966, he made the choice. He decided to leave. This was not a casual move for a gig. This was a betrayal of everything he was raised to believe in. He was turning his back on the practical world and his home. He was taking his ambition, his noise, and placing a massive, terrifying bet on himself. And crucially, he was not alone in this decision. He made the move with his brother Jerry. This is not a solo act of rebellion. He took his only practical family, his labor crew. With him, he was not running away from his family. He was taking his family with him to a new job site. They didn't go to New York, and they didn't go to Los Angeles. They went to the epicenter of the New World. They went to San Francisco. The San Francisco that Dickie and Jerry Peterson arrived in was a city in the middle of a cultural explosion. It was 1966, the dawn of the summer of love. The Haight-Ashbury scene was a swirling, chaotic world of LSD, flower power, and Eastern philosophy. It was a world of ethereal, floating peace and love music. And into this world of beads, incense, and cosmic philosophy walks Dickie Peterson. We must understand what a profound culture clash this was. He was not a flower child in the slightest. He was not a poet looking for enlightenment. He was a musical laborer from the frozen, practical plains of North Dakota. He was an introvert with a laborer's work ethic, a man who played his instrument with force. He was, once again, a misfit. He was an outsider in this new world of psychedelic dreamers, just as he had been an outsider in the practical world of Grand Forks, the dominant sound of the scene. Bands like the Grateful Dead was not his noise. That was complex, rambling, intellectual head music. For floating Dickie Peterson's music was music for punching. It was raw, primal, and visceral. It was the noise from his practical past, not the dream of his psychedelic present. He needed a crew that understood this. He needed other laborers who understood that music wasn't just about expanding your mind. It was about raw power. His first move was practical and loyal. He and his brother Jerry formed a band, trying to make it work. But the misfit finds other misfits. In this swirling sea of flower power, he found his own tribe. He found a manager named Gut Turk, a former Hell's Angel. This is the key connection. He had rejected the practical world of the Midwest, only to find the new practical world of the outlaw biker. The Hell's Angels were also laborers in their own way. They were also outsiders. They were also misfits who valued power and authenticity over pretty surfaces. Dickie Peterson had found his new foreman. Under Gut Turk's management, the ambition began to take shape, but the noise in his head, the invention, was still trapped. He needed to strip it down. He needed to find the heavy machine. And then he had his revelation. The practical laborer saw the future. He saw Jimi Hendrix and Cream. This was the epiphany. Hendrix was the fusion. He was psychedelic, but also raw blues and extreme volume. He was a power trio. He was lean, efficient, and heavy. Dickie Peterson saw the heavy machine in its perfect practical form. He returned with a blueprint. He made a decision that was as practical as it was brutal. He stripped the band down. He formed the core. He found Paul Whaley, a drummer. Whaley wasn't a peace and love percussionist. He was a powerhouse. He played with a hard, driving, primal force that was the perfect rhythmic engine for Peterson's bass. And they found Lee Stevens, a guitarist. Stevens was a savant of the noise that Peterson had been chasing. He was a master of the fuzz pedal, the feedback, the overdriven sound. He wasn't playing clean riffs. He was playing sheets of electric power. This was the moment. The heavy machine was assembled. This was not a band in the San Francisco sense. This was a power trio, a three-man labor crew. Peterson on bass, Whaley on drums, Stevens on guitar. This was the ambition, finally given its tools. They needed a name for this noise. They took one from the scene around them, Blue Cheer. It was the name of a potent, popular strain of LSD, a name that rooted them firmly in the ambition of the Haight-Ashbury. But the sound was the opposite of a dreamy acid trip. It was a punch in the face. And at the center of this storm was Dickie Peterson, the introvert from North Dakota. The laborer who had chosen the bass now, he was also the lead singer. This created a new internal war. The practical introvert was now forced to be the ambition's voice. This explains his guttural, sinister vocal style. He wasn't singing like a pop star. He was shouting, screaming to be heard over his own noise. He was forcing the words out, a laborer operating his vocal cords with the same raw force as his bass. This tension would come to define his entire life. The heavy machine was now fully assembled and operational, a perfect fusion of three laborers and their tools. Dickie Peterson had made the most brutal, practical decision of his life. He had sacrificed his blood, his brother Jerry, his last link to his North Dakota past, for the future of his ambition. He had found his new foreman in the outlaw Gut Turk and his labor crew in the powerhouse drumming of Paul Whaley and the screaming, feedback-drenched guitar of Lee Stevens. He was an orphan who had at last built a new, practical family, a family dedicated to a single, ear-splitting purpose: the noise. This was not a band of dreamers looking to change the world through love. This was a power trio in the truest sense, a three-man labor crew looking to change the world through force. They were the misfits of the Haight-Ashbury, the practical farmhand, the outlaw manager, and the two other misfits, who understood that music wasn't just about consciousness, it was about power. They began to gig around the Bay Area, and the sound they produced was not psychedelic in the way San Francisco understood it. It was violent. While bands like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane were playing ethereal music to float to, Blue Cheer played music to brace yourself against. It was the sound of Dickie's tractor engine bass, the sound of his anger, his grief, his orphan trauma, and his North Dakota isolation, all turned up to an impossible volume. This noise was so pure, so different, and so undeniably heavy that it couldn't be ignored by the industry. The ambition was about to meet the gatekeepers. That gatekeeper came in the form of Philips Records, a major label owned by a massive European electronics corporation. This, for Dickie, must have been the ultimate validation of his work. A practical corporation, a giant of industry, was at last recognizing the value of his ambition. They were signed in 1967 by a man named Abe Voco Kesh, a radio DJ and producer who had heard their noise and saw something marketable. However, Voco Kesh and the executives at Philips did not see a band of laborers. They saw a product to capitalize on the exploding psychedelic craze. They saw the name Blue Cheer, a potent strain of Owsley Stanley's LSD, and they saw dollar signs. They saw the manager, a Hell's Angel, and they saw counterculture credibility. They checked all the psychedelic boxes on their marketing spreadsheets. This was the first subtle and most devastating corruption of the laborer's purity. The practical man from North Dakota, who had rebelled against the survival code of the farm, was now an employee of a massive, non-practical coastal corporation. The ambition was winning, but it was now on someone else's terms, sold as something it wasn't. He was no longer just a laborer operating his own machine. He was a commodity in someone else's catalog. This fundamental misunderstanding, the laborer versus the product, would define the band's entire brief career. The label wanted a psychedelic experience to sell to hippies. Dickie Peterson wanted to work and make the loudest sound on earth. This conflict was just his father's practical versus ambition war, now played out on a national scale with lawyers and contracts. But a contract was a contract, and to the practical man from the farm, this was a job. He had a duty to produce a product in exchange for his wage. In late 1967, the labor crew gathered their tools and went to work. They entered the studio to record their debut album, the album that would become Vinspis Eruptum. They entered Amigo Studios in North Hollywood, a facility that was, until that moment, a place of practical recording science. The engineers were trained professionals, men of the order who understood how to balance levels, place microphones, and capture clean, warm sounds. They were about to be confronted by Dickie Peterson's heavy machine, a force that defied every rule they knew. Dickie Peterson, the musical laborer, was not there to make a record in the traditional artistic sense. He was there to operate his machine at its full terrifying capacity, just as he did on stage. He plugged his bass not into a standard bass amp, but into a massive guitar amp. He used a Marshall stack, a tower of power designed for screaming leads, not low-end rhythm. He turned the fuzz dial all the way up, creating a thick, distorted square wave. And then, the most critical step, he turned the volume all the way up to 10. We must understand what this means in the context of 1967 recording technology. A bass guitar was supposed to be a rhythm instrument, a subtle background pulse that locked with the kick drum. Dickie Peterson, the laborer from the tractor farm, knew the bass was the engine, and he was forcing the engine to the front. This was his invention, the bass as a lead instrument of pure noise. The studio engineers were reportedly horrified as the VU meters didn't just go into the red, they stayed there, pinned against the plastic. The noise was so loud it was leaking into every other microphone in the room, bleeding into the drum tracks, the vocals, the very walls. The sound itself was deemed unrecordable by the practical standards of the day. The legend of the recording session is that the band was simply too loud for the isolation booths. To capture the sheer physicality of the air moving, they reportedly had to record parts of the album outside or in a massive concrete shipping dock. They treated the studio not as a delicate instrument, but as a foundry. This was not music in the polite sense. This was an assault. This was the sound of Dickie Peterson's entire life. The sound of the prairie silence and the practical oppression, exploding all at once. It was the sound of the tractor engine bass, the feedback-drenched guitar of Lee Stevens, and the primal powerhouse drumming of Paul Whaley. It was the noise in his head, finally given a practical physical form on magnetic tape. But the practical corporation, Philips, needed a product they could sell on the radio. They needed a hit. They needed a single that could bridge the gap between this psychedelic noise and the average teenager's wallet. The laborer had to provide a commercial item to justify his employment. Their choice for the single was a stroke of subversive, accidental genius. They didn't write a peace and love anthem about flowers in your hair. They didn't write a cosmic jam about the universe. They chose a song from the practical past. They chose Eddie Cochran's 1958 rockabilly hit, Summertime Blues. This was, in itself, a brilliant practical decision because it was a cover, it was a known quantity, a song with a proven melody and a hook that everyone recognized. But it was also a thematic masterpiece that fit Dickie Peterson perfectly. The song is, at its core, a complaint about the practical world. It is a teenager trapped in the survival code, forced to work a practical job instead of enjoying his life. This was Dickie Peterson's entire life story condensed into 3 minutes. It was the practical world denying his ambition. It was his practical versus ambition war, already written by someone else. And then they deconstructed it. They fed this practical pop song into their heavy machine and ground it down to its bones. They turned a bouncy teenage complaint into a slow, grinding, existential roar. Listen to their version of Summertime Blues. It is terrifying. Dickie's guttural shouting vocal is not singing. In the traditional sense, it is the sound of a laborer shouting over the roar of his own machine. It's the introvert forcing his ambition out through a wall of distortion. The bass is not a rhythm. It is an earthquake. The guitar solo is not melodic. It is a scream. This was the invention fully realized. They had taken the practical past and run it through the ambitional present. They had created a new sound, something that was neither blues nor pop, and the world heard it. The record was released in early 1968. Summertime Blues was a hit. It shot to number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album Vinspus Eruptum climbed to number 11 on the Billboard 200. This is insane for the time. This noise, this unpractical anti-music sound, was a commercial success. Dickie Peterson, the misfit from North Dakota, the orphan, the laborer, had built a hit. His ambition was validated beyond his wildest dreams. The practical world of his family, his failure complex, his inferiority, it was all definitively wrong. The noise was not a waste of time. It was a top 20 hit record generating real money. But this brings us to the central tragic conflict of his life. Dickie Peterson, the introvert from North Dakota, was now officially a pop star, and he was hated. He was despised by the very people he thought he was joining. He was hated by the gatekeepers of the practical world, the critics. They were appalled by the sound. They didn't hear ambition or power. They heard incompetence. They called it sludge. They called it noise pollution. Rolling Stone magazine, the Bible of the new ambition scene, dismissed it, calling them the worst band. And he was also hated by the gatekeepers of the other ambition world, the hippies. The peace and LOVE dreamers of the Haight-Ashbury were horrified by the aggression of Blue Cheer. This wasn't cosmic music for expanding your mind. This was lowbrow, violent, primitive noise for banging your head. It was not the sound of their revolution. In a famous story, the band was reportedly kicked off a tour with the Grateful Dead. The dreamers could not stand the laborers. The Dead were about vibes. Blue Cheer was about volume. He was a misfit again. He was a star, but he was an outsider star. His labor was a hit, but it was despised by everyone who mattered in the cultural elite. This created a profound psychological loneliness at the peak of his fame. He wasn't the practical son. He wasn't the psychedelic dreamer. He was just the loud guy. So he leaned in. This is the only practical response for a man with a chip on his shoulder. If he couldn't be the prettiest or the smartest or the most spiritual, he would be the loudest. This became their legend, their marketing hook, and their armor, the loudest band on earth. This is a laborer's metric. It is quantifiable. It is tangible. This is a practical man's only defense against criticism. It's not about art. It's about power. It's about volume. It's about heavy machinery. When asked about his art, he would famously bristle. He was a laborer. He worked. This ambition was a physical assault on the audience. It was a war against the silence of his past. It was a war against the ethereal hippies. It was a war against the practical critics. It was him against the world. And this pressure, this war was unbearable. The practical man was trapped in the star's body. The introvert was forced to be a front man every single night, screaming at thousands of people. He was hated by critics and misunderstood by his peers. He was a hit maker who was not famous. He was infamous. He needed an escape. He needed a painkiller, just like Danny Whitten and Clarence Clemens. He needed to silence the new noise in his head, the noise of fame, the noise of failure, the noise of loneliness. And the San Francisco scene, which had rejected his sound, gladly provided the painkiller. Drugs were everywhere. But for Dickie, this was not the experimental LSD of the dreamers. This was the hard stuff. This was heroin. This was a practical choice. In the darkest sense, heroin is not an ambition drug. It is a survival drug. It is a numbing agent. It is a practical tool to stop pain. It was the laborer trying to numb the pain of ambition. The heavy machine was now running on a new, more toxic fuel, and it was starting to break down. The labor crew was not designed for fame. It was designed for work. And this fame was a poison that was eating them alive. The practical corporation Philips was demanding another hit. "Give us another Summertime Blues," they said. But Dickie Peterson was a laborer, not a pop star. He couldn't replicate the invention on command. He wasn't a product. He was a process. So in an act of pure, practical defiance, their second album, Outside Inside, was even heavier. It was louder. It was less commercial. It was a fuck you to the gatekeepers who wanted a product. The title itself was a practical joke. They had recorded half of it outside on a pier in New York Harbor because they claimed they couldn't be contained by the practical walls of the studio anymore. This was the ambition of the noise, taken to its literal absurd conclusion. They were screaming at the ocean. The album failed to produce a hit. It failed to sell as well as the first. The practical corporation was not happy. The fame was already fading, and the work was getting harder. The labor crew was in a state of collapse. They were touring constantly, fueled by drugs and the crushing pressure to maintain the title of the loudest band on earth. The noise was no longer just an ambition, it was a prison. The physical toll was immense. This wasn't just psychological. The volume was a physical assault on the laborers themselves. Paul Whaley, the drummer, was physically exhausted, and Lee Stevens, the guitarist, the man who was the other half of the noise, the savant of the fuzz, he was done. He couldn't take the volume anymore. He couldn't take the drugs. He couldn't take the pressure of Dickie's driving ambition. In late 1968, Lee Stevens quit. This was a catastrophe. This was not a lineup change. This was the engine being ripped out of the heavy machine. The labor crew was broken. The distinctive sound, the friction between Dickie's bass and Lee's guitar, was gone. For Dickie Peterson, this was the first wound all over again. He was orphaned professionally. He had betrayed his blood brother for this new practical family, and now this family had abandoned him. The loneliness and failure complex came roaring back. But the practical man from North Dakota must work. The survival code demands it. He couldn't stop. The ambition was still driving him. He scrambled. He had to keep working. He hired a new guitarist, Randy Holden, a fantastic player, but not Stevens. They rushed back into the studio to record their third album. In 1969, they released New Improved Blue Cheer. The name itself is the entire heartbreaking tragedy. It's a practical commercial label slapped on a broken machine, like a sticker on a faulty appliance. It was a desperate attempt by the laborer to market his product to please the gatekeepers. It was a betrayal of his own noise. The album was split, one side featuring Randy Holden's heavy guitar, the other side featuring lighter, almost country rock songs. It was an identity crisis on vinyl, and it flopped. Randy Holden quit during the recording touring cycle. The machine was disintegrating. The labor crew was a revolving door of hired hands. The invention was over. The fame was gone. The hit was a memory the Godfather of volume had created his masterpiece, and it had destroyed him. He had won his war against the practical world, only to find that the ambition he had achieved was a lie. He was 23 years old. He was a cult figure with an addiction, and he was once again a misfit, now trapped in the wilderness of the 1970s, with no crew, no label, and no home. The heavy machine was in pieces, a pile of scrap metal on the floor of the Haight-Ashbury dream. Dickie Peterson, the musical laborer, was now unemployed, his practical family shattered by the very fame his ambition had craved. He was a 23-year-old inventor who had just watched his invention be stolen, repackaged, and perfected by bands in England. He was now entering the darkest, most practical period of his life, the 1970s, a decade of addiction, health failures, and profound crushing anonymity where his only job would be survival. This was the ultimate devastating silence. The Godfather of volume had been silenced by his own industry. The noise, the ambition that had been his armor against the orphan trauma, the misfit complex, and the practical world was gone. And in that silence, all the old noises, the failure complex, the guilt over his brother, the inferiority of North Dakota came roaring back. He was once again that outsider farmhand looking for a place to belong. And the practical man, the laborer from the farm, had to face a new terrifying reality. His only trade, his only skill, was now obsolete. He was a master of a machine that no one wanted to buy anymore. This was not just a career failure. This was an existential one. The collapse of Blue Cheer in 1969 was not a clean break. It was a slow, agonizing disintegration. The failure of the new improved album was the final practical proof that his ambition was a lie. The laborer had not only betrayed his brother Jerry for this noise, he had failed even after doing so. The failure complex, born from his orphan trauma and his practical upbringing, was now confirmed by the gatekeepers of the ambition world. He was, in every sense of the word, lost in the cultural wilderness. He was an introvert with no crew to back him up. He was a front man with no stage to stand on. He was a laborer with no job to go to in the morning. The entire structure of his life, the new family he had built with Whaley and Stevens, the new foreman he had found in Gut Turk, and the new corporation that had paid him for his labor, it was all gone. This psychological defeat was total and encompassing. And when the ambition died, when the noise of his heavy machine fell silent, the only noise left was the screaming of his own loneliness and failure. The only thing that could silence that noise was the painkiller he had found in San Francisco. His addiction, which had begun as a painkiller for the stress of fame, now became his new practical job. This is the tragic laborer's logic of the addict. His ambition was gone, but the need for survival remained. And survival, for Dickie, now meant surviving the day. His life in the early 1970s was no longer about music or creating art. It was about surviving the silence of his own mind. It was about numbing the failure complex that threatened to consume him. It was the practical code of the addict: survive the day, get the painkiller, endure the silence. He was, in a tragic and twisted irony, right back in the survival world he had spent his entire life trying to escape, only this practical job was infinitely more destructive. He was a ghost in his own kingdom, haunting the streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco. He was a misfit who had failed at being a misfit. He had no crew, no foreman, no label to give him direction. He was just the introvert from the farm, now haunted by the noise he had made and the fame he had so briefly touched. And here is the most brutal, most unjust, and most central tragedy of Dickie Peterson's entire story. As he faded into this practical haze of addiction, obscurity, and failure, his invention was conquering the planet. In 1970, just months after Blue Cheer's collapse, a new labor crew from the practical working-class city of Birmingham, England, released their debut album. That band was Black Sabbath. They had taken the blueprint from Vinspus Eruptum. They had taken the heavy machine bass, the distorted, sludgy noise, the primitive power, and they had perfected it. They slowed it down to a funeral march. They added the occult theatrics that the introvert Dickie Peterson, the practical laborer, would have found ridiculous. They were not laborers in the same raw sense. They were showmen, and they were brilliant at selling the noise. Almost immediately, other crews who had been laboring on a similar path also exploded into global superstardom. Led Zeppelin, in 1970, released Led Zeppelin III, moving further into the heavy sound that dominated the era. And Deep Purple in 1970 released In Rock, a complete reinvention, a total embrace of the heavy noise that Blue Cheer had pioneered 2 years earlier. They were the ones who built the empire on the foundation that Dickie Peterson had laid. They were the ones getting rich beyond imagination. They were the ones becoming stars on a global scale. They were the ones selling out stadiums. Their ambition was being rewarded with billions of dollars. And Dickie Peterson? He was nowhere. He was the Godfather, but he was not invited to the feast. He was the laborer who had invented the engine, only to watch everyone else drive his car to the kingdom. This injustice, this theft of his ambition, must have been a living hell. It was the misfit being told once again that he did not belong. This wasn't a failure of his ambition. This was a success of his ambition, but a total failure of his practicality. He had invented the product, but the laborer had no business sense to protect it. He had no patent on the heavy sound. He had, in the practical sense, been robbed. This injustice would define the rest of his life, fueling a bitterness and a deeper failure complex. He was not, however, a nobody. And this is the strangest, cruelest part of his wilderness. He became, as the source material states, a cult figure. He was the inventor known only to the aficionados, the musicians, the underground, who read the liner notes. He was the outsider's outsider, the misfit's misfit, the ultimate cult hero. This cult status was in itself a practical prison. It was a kingdom of no commercial value. It gave him no money to pay the rent. It gave him no fame to feed his ego. It only gave him the respect of an underground that was just as broke, just as addicted, and just as misfit as he was. He was the patron saint of failure. He was the laborer who had refused to sell out. His failure was now, ironically, his brand. His inability to be practical in the business sense was now the proof of his practical authenticity as a laborer. This cult status was an impossible trap to escape. To maintain his cult status, he had to remain a failure. If he ever had a hit again, he would lose his cult status and be seen as a sellout. He was a godfather trapped in the ghetto of his own invention. This cult status, this respect from the underground, provided no survival. It was an ambition with no practical reward. This only deepened the injustice and the need for the practical painkiller, his addiction. But the laborer must work. The practical man must produce. He was a musician. He had to play because it was the only trade he knew. In 1974, he tried again to re-enter the workforce. He pulled himself together long enough to enter a studio. He released a solo album, simply titled Dickie Peterson, and later worked on a project called Peter M. and the Wolves. But this was not the noise of 1968. This was not Vince Eruptum. This was a retreat. It was a blues rock album. It was the laborer returning to his roots. To the source, it was the sound of his practical apprenticeship in North Dakota, not the ambition of San Francisco. This was a practical move. He was, in essence, applying for a job. He was proving to the gatekeepers of the industry that he was not just the noise machine. He was a real musician. He was a laborer with skills. He was trying to be practical. He was also, on a psychological level, fleeing his invention. The noise was a trauma. It was the sound of his failure. It was the sound of his abandonment. It was the sound that broke his family. He couldn't go back to the noise. So he retreated to the safety of the blues. And it was a catastrophic commercial failure. The gatekeepers at the labels didn't want a blues rock album from Dickie Peterson. They didn't know what to do with him. He was a misfit product, and the cult, his only kingdom, also rejected it. They didn't want the practical laborer. They wanted the Godfather of volume. They wanted the noise machine. Years later, in 1984, he would try one more desperate, practical gamble with an album called The Beast Is Back. It was an attempt to modernize, to sell out in the era of hair metal. It was slick, it was polished, and it was a disaster. It proved that the laborer could not work in the plastic factory of the 1980s. He was betrayed by both worlds. The practical world rejected his labor, and the ambition world rejected his retreat. He had no kingdom left. He was truly an orphan again. The failure of his solo labor and the disastrous attempts at modernization were the final straw. He was unhireable in America. He was a cult figure with no cult willing to pay. He was an inventor with no product. He was a laborer with no job. The ambition was truly dead in his homeland. The rest of the 1970s and most of the 1980s are the ghost years. He drifted. He was in California. He was somewhere. He was a ghost, haunting the fringes of the kingdom he had built. And then he made the most practical move of his life. He went into exile. He moved to Germany. Why Germany? This is not a random choice. This is the practical laborer moving to a new job site. In the 1970s and 80s, Germany had a thriving underground market for heavy music. Krautrock and the burgeoning heavy metal scene revered authenticity. They revered cult figures. In America, he was a failure. In Germany, he was a success. He was a godfather. He was an elder statesman. He was the inventor. This was a practical survival move. He was a laborer, moving to the one place on earth that would pay for his labor. He was an exile, but he was a working exile. He spent most of the 1980s in this wilderness, living in Germany, sometimes back in California, chasing the cult status he was surviving. But this survival was a grind. He was not rich. He was poor. He was the godfather, but he was struggling to pay the bills. The injustice was his daily reality. He was the inventor, living in a small apartment, while the thieves were buying castles. And he worked the laborer must work. He would occasionally, as the source material states, put together reunions of Blue Cheer. But these were not glorious comebacks like the E Street Band. These were not ambition. These were practical gigs. These were the laborer needing to work, needing to survive. These were gigs in small, dark, underground clubs. These were reunions with no practical stability. The lineups were a revolving door of hired hands, not a family. He was a cult figure playing to his cult. He was a misfit playing to the misfits. He was the inventor, forced to be his own cover band, playing summertime blues night after night for beer money. This was the lowest point. This was the ultimate practical humiliation. The godfather of volume was hustling. He was grinding. He was the inventor reduced to laboring in his own ruined factory. And the addiction, the painkiller, was his only practical partner. It was the only reliable thing in his life. The noise of failure and injustice was too loud, and the painkiller was the only thing that worked. His health was collapsing. The heavy machine, his body, was being destroyed by the practical work of being an addict. The ambition was now just a means to fund the survival. He was a man trapped in a perfect, fatal, practical loop. He was a ghost, waiting for the kingdom he had built to finally remember his name, or for his practical body, ravaged by addiction and health failures, to finally, mercifully give up. Dickie Peterson, the musical laborer, was at his absolute nadir in the late 1980s. He was a ghost in a battered van, a godfather hustling for survival in the small, smoky clubs of Germany, his practical body disintegrating under the weight of his addiction and his failure. He was an exile, a man forgotten by the glittering kingdom of rock and roll that he had helped to build. He was the inventor of the engine, now reduced to selling spare parts for gas money just to get to the next town. The injustice was total, the poverty was grinding, and the silence of his failure was deafening. But the world was changing, shifting on its axis in a way that Dickie, in his exile, could barely perceive. While he was laboring in obscurity, his invention was being rediscovered by a generation he had never met. A new generation of misfits, kids from the rain-soaked practical garages of Seattle, Washington, was emerging from the underground. These kids, born in the late 60s and 70s, had grown up in the shadow of the stadium rock that Dickie's thieves had perfected, and they hated it. They despised the slick, commercial, hairspray-covered pop metal of the 1980s. They were rejecting the product and the fame that the industry was selling. They were searching for something real, something that felt like dirty hands and hard work. They were searching for something raw, authentic, and heavy, a sound that spoke to their own feelings of alienation. They were searching for the laborer's truth in a world of plastic lies. And in their search, digging through the dusty, forgotten crates of rock history, they found Vince Eruptum. They found the Godfather. This new generation, the kids in bands like the Melvins, Mudhoney, Soundgarden, and eventually Nirvana, didn't just like Blue Cheer. They revered it as a holy text. They cited it as year zero, the moment when rock became something visceral and dangerous. This wasn't a hit song to them. This was a sacred blueprint for how to be loud and honest. They heard in Dickie Peterson's tractor engine bass and guttural shout the same misfit, failure complex, and practical anger that fueled them, this grunge and stoner rock movement, which was about to explode and destroy the slick 80s product, was a revival of the laborer ethic. It was a generation hungry for the heavy machine sound that Dickie Peterson had invented and been punished for 20 years earlier. They saw him not as a failure, but as a martyr who had refused to compromise. This revival, this new ambition of the underground, created a market where there had been none. It was not a stadium market filled with casual fans. It was not a pop market driven by radio hits. It was a practical niche market fueled by obsessives and purists, promoters in Europe, especially Germany and Scandinavia, where he was already an exiled cult figure. And in Japan, places that had always revered heavy music saw an opportunity. The Godfather was suddenly, in this small underground way, in demand again. The factory whistle was blowing, calling the foreman back to the line. For Dickie Peterson, the practical man, this wasn't fame returning in a blaze of glory. This wasn't ambition being finally and publicly vindicated on the cover of Rolling Stone. This was a job offer. This was a contract to perform a service. This was a practical opportunity to work and pay the bills. And the practical laborer, whose addiction was expensive and whose only marketable skill was the noise, must work. And so in 1989, Dickie Peterson resurrected Blue Cheer from the dead. This was not the new improved product of 1969, a desperate, confused plea to the gatekeepers of the industry. This was the practical labor of 1989, a direct response to a demand from the underground market. This was the laborer returning to the factory because the factory was unbelievably reopening for business. But this was not the original labor crew that had stormed San Francisco. This was not the practical family he had built and lost in the 60s. Lee Stevens, the original noise guitarist, was long gone, his ambition permanently burned out by the fame and volume of 1968. Paul Whaley, the powerhouse drummer, was in and out, his own life a parallel tragedy of addiction and health failures, a mirror of Dickie's own ghost years. This reunion was something different, something harder and more pragmatic. It was Dickie Peterson, the practical boss, the foreman, hiring new laborers to help him operate the heavy machine he had invented. He brought in men like guitarist Andrew "Duck" McDonald, a laborer who understood the noise, who had the practical skill to replicate the invention without the ego. This was the only way his practical mind could process this new ambition. He had a product, and he was taking it back to the factory. He was no longer the introvert frontman of 1968, young and pretty and dangerous. He was the grizzled 43-year-old foreman of 1989, weathered by addiction and disappointment. This was his ambition, now stripped of all fame, reduced to its practical core. The work itself, he was a survivor. He was the misfit who had outlived his failure. He now had a purpose again, to labor until the job was done. And so he worked with a relentless blue-collar fury. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, this new blue cheer toured constantly. They toured Europe, where the cult was strongest. They toured Japan, where they were treated like royalty in small rooms. They toured the small underground clubs of America, sleeping in cheap motels. They were not playing stadiums like their thieves, Black Sabbath. They were not opening for Metallica, receiving the check they deserved. They were playing the exact same small, dark, sweaty, beer-soaked clubs they had played in the 1970s. The venue had not changed, only the date on the calendar. But the audience inside those clubs was different. It was not the hippies. It was not the critics. It was the kids. It was the punks with safety pins. It was the metalheads in denim vests. It was the grunge kids in flannel. It was the stoner rock disciples who worshiped the riff. These kids looked at Dickie Peterson, this old man with his heavy machine bass and his long graying hair, and they didn't see a failure. They didn't see a misfit or a has-been. They saw the inventor of their world. They saw the Godfather. They saw God in a leather jacket. They saw the authentic article, the practical laborer who had never sold out, who had never changed his noise to fit the trends. This was his true kingdom, the one he had been searching for since North Dakota. It was not a kingdom of money or fame or gold records. It was a kingdom of the underground, built on respect and volume. It was a kingdom of misfits, and he was at last their king. His ambition had finally been validated not by the gatekeepers in the offices, but by the other laborers in the pit. But this practical work was the most brutal labor of his life. This was not a triumphant comeback tour with private jets and doctors on call. This was a grind. He wasn't touring in a luxury bus. He was in a van, driving countless hours between cities. A 50-year-old practical laborer, a cult figure, still sleeping on floors, still loading his own heavy gear. And the painkiller, the addiction, was still there, riding shotgun. It was his constant companion, the ghost that never left. It was the grease that kept the heavy machine running when the joints began to rust. This practical laborer was now aging, his body slowing down while the music stayed fast. He was hustling in a van, a 50-year-old addict, trying to keep up with the ambition of his youth. His practical body, the laborer's tool that he had been abusing for 30 years with noise, drugs, failure, and poverty, was failing. The years of heroin, of alcohol, of cheap food, and little sleep were collecting their debt. The ambition was now at war with survival. This cult status, this Godfather title, it didn't pay the medical bills. He was still poor. He was still the laborer who built the skyscraper but couldn't afford the rent to live in it. This injustice was the fuel that kept him going. He was still the misfit from North Dakota, still trying to prove to his practical past that his ambition was worth it. He had to keep working because stopping meant admitting defeat. The practical code demanded labor until the end. He was the Godfather, but he was also the orphan from the farm who had no safety net. He was grateful for this work, despite the pain. This grind, this van tour, this was his kingdom. It was honest. It was practical. It was real. It was everything the fame of 1968 wasn't. In 2007, he entered the studio for the last time. He was 60 years old, a survivor of the wildest era in rock history. He, Paul Whaley, and Duck McDonald gathered to make a statement. The Labor crew was back on the site. They released the final Blue Cheer album. The title of this album is the entire thesis of Dickie Peterson's life. It is the motto of the practical laborer. It is the creed of the misfit orphan from the farm who refused to die. It was called What Doesn't Kill Me. This was the ultimate practical laborer's statement of defiance. It was a guttural scream at the world that had ignored him. It was a fuck you to the fame that had rejected him, to the addiction that had tried to claim him, to the poverty that still held him, and to the silence of his past. The sound of this album was not a pop move or a soft farewell. It was not a reunion album designed to sell merchandise. It was raw. It was heavy. It was brutal. It was the sound of the heavy machine running hot. It was the Godfather, now 60 years old, still operating the heavy machine with the same force he had at 20. It was his ambition, stripped of all fame and fortune, reduced to its purest form, the work itself. But the heavy machine, his body, was finally breaking down beyond repair. The title was a brave, defiant lie. The work was killing him. In 2009, his practical body, the laborer's tool that he had abused for 40 years in service of the noise, finally, definitively failed. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And because he was a laborer without practical health care, because he had ignored the warnings, it was not early, it was advanced. It was aggressive. It had spread to his liver. This was the one practical reality he could not work his way out of. This was the one ambition he could not will into existence with sheer volume. His practical body, the laborer's tool, had betrayed him, finally and completely. He stopped working. He had to. The heavy machine was broken, and the factory was closed. The Godfather of volume was, at last, being silenced. And he moved to Germany. This is the final heartbreaking symbolic act of his life. He did not go back to California. He did not go back to North Dakota. He went to the one place on earth that had revered him as a cult figure and treated him with dignity. He went to the job site that appreciated his heavy music. He went to the kingdom that had, in his wilderness years, crowned him king. He was not dying in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills like a rock star. He was not in a practical home in Grand Forks like a retiree. He was in a small, quiet town, Erkelenz. He was an exile. He was the misfit, outsider, orphan, to the very end. And on October 12th, 2009, Richard Allen Dickie Peterson died. He was 63 years old. He died in poverty. He died with almost no money to his name. This is the final brutal injustice of his story. The Godfather of volume was silenced by a disease he couldn't afford to fight. The inventor of the billion-dollar sound, The sound that built the empires of Black Sabbath, Metallica, and Nirvana died, broke. The ambition had won in the abstract sense, but the practical man had lost everything. He was the laborer who built the entire city of heavy metal and died homeless outside its gates. When the Godfather of volume was finally silenced, what did his noise truly leave behind? It is not in the money he never made. It is not in the fame he never kept. It is not in the kingdom of the thieves who took his sound. His legacy is that one raw, perfect, practical act of labor, Vinspus eruptum. It is the sound of the misfit from North Dakota, proving to the world and to his father that noise was a valid form of work. It is the blueprint for the entire genre of heavy music. His tragedy is the practical man's tragedy. He did the work, but he never got paid. He was not a star, he was a sacrifice. He was the Godfather who died for the sins of his invention so that others could be loud. The silence of the North Dakota plains, the practical world he had rebelled against, was finally, permanently, and globally defeated by the noise he left behind. But in the end, the silence came for him anyway.